today's mindful moment. Ever get the feeling that some of the ideas that we just take for granted, like we all know them, were once considered radical?
Yeah,
Like way out there.
absolutely.
Today we are diving into the world of Milton Friedman,
Okay.
a figure whose influence it extends far beyond the realm of just economics.
That's a great place to start. You might not know his name, but his fingerprints are all over the policies that we see today.
Mhm.
From taxes withheld from our paychecks to arguments about school vouchers and even universal basic income,
Yeah.
he offered a whole philosophy of freedom.
Mm.
And whether you agree with his views or not understanding them is crucial to understanding the world we live in.
And it's fascinating how his ideas went from the fringes of academic thought, like really out there, to shaping global policies.
Yeah.
But he wasn't always popular, though in fact there were protests when he was awarded the Nobel Prize, which shows how controversial some of his views were.
Yeah.
So where did this journey begin? Let's take a look at Friedman's early life and the experiences that molded his thinking.
His childhood offers some valuable insights growing up Jewish in small-town New Jersey. He faced anti-Semitism firsthand.
Wow.
Imagine a burning cross erected by the Ku Klux Klan just blocks from your home.
Oh my gosh.
That experience, coupled with his early questioning of his religious upbringing, likely played a role in shaping his deep skepticism of unchecked authority, including government overreach.
It's almost as if from a young age he was grappling with these fundamental questions about freedom and individual liberty.
Right.
And then, on a larger scale, the Great Depression hits, which had a profound impact on his worldview.
Oh, yeah.
He was wrestling with how capitalism could provide widespread prosperity, while also seeking ways to help those in need without hindering economic growth.
These were defining questions for his generation. It was during this time that Friedman went to the University of Chicago, a renowned hub for economic thought.
Of course.
He was immersed in neoclassical economics, which emphasizes the idea that free markets driven by individual self-interest are the most efficient way to allocate resources.
Okay.
One of the core concepts within this school of thought is price theory, which views prices as signals that coordinate the actions of buyers and sellers, leading to an equilibrium between supply and demand.
Okay.
However, this put him at odds with the prevailing Keynesian ideas of the time, which advocated for greater government intervention in the economy, particularly during times of crisis.
So we're seeing the seeds of his future skepticism towards big government being sown right there in his academic training.
Right.
But his ideas weren't just theoretical.
Yeah.
He had real-world experiences that further solidified his beliefs.
Exactly. One pivotal experience was his work on the New Deal study of consumer purchases.
Okay.
He was applying economic theory to real-world data, tracking how families spend their money.
Interesting.
You might think this would have made him more supportive of government intervention, but it actually had the opposite effect.
What do you mean?
Well, by analyzing this data, Friedman saw firsthand how complex and nuanced people's economic decisions really are. It led him to question the government's ability to truly understand and manage those choices effectively. Think about it. Every individual has unique needs and preferences, and the market, through its intricate system of prices and incentives, is often better suited to cater to those individual choices than a centralized government agency.
That's a really interesting point. It's like he was working within the system, yet his experiences were leading him to question its very foundations.
Precisely, and this skepticism towards government intervention was further reinforced during World War II.
Oh, wow.
He worked at the Treasury Department, contributing to the war effort, but he also vehemently opposed price controls, which were a common wartime measure. He saw them as ineffective and ultimately harmful to the economy. He argued that price controls create shortages and distortions in the market, leading to unintended consequences. It's about understanding that prices are not arbitrary. They convey crucial information about scarcity and value. By manipulating prices artificially, you disrupt the natural flow of information and incentives in the market.
That makes sense. And during this period, he also made significant contributions to the field of statistics with his work on sequential analysis.
Yes.
A statistical method with wide-ranging applications, even beyond economics.
His work on sequential analysis had a lasting impact on fields like medical research and quality control. It highlights how seemingly theoretical work can have practical applications in unexpected areas.
So we have Friedman, armed with his academic training and real-world experiences, returning to the University of Chicago, ready to take on the economic establishment. This is where he really starts to build his reputation and challenge the prevailing Keynesian ideas.
Right, he finds himself in the midst of another intellectual battle, this time with the Cowles Commission, known for its complex mathematical models of the economy. Friedman, always a pragmatist, critiqued their heavy reliance on abstract theory and advocated for a greater emphasis on empirical data and real-world observation. He believed that economic theories should be testable and grounded in evidence, not just elegant mathematical constructs.
So out of this clash of ideas emerges a new school of thought, the Second Chicago School with Friedman at the forefront.
Exactly.
He wasn't alone in this battle. He was building a network of like-minded thinkers who shared his skepticism of government intervention and his belief in the power of free markets.
Right.
One of his key collaborators was George Stigler, and together they challenged conventional wisdom on everything from monopolies to the role of government regulation.
Their ideas were considered quite radical at the time.
Yeah.
But they began to gain traction, particularly among a younger generation of economists who were looking for alternatives to the dominant Keynesian paradigm. And they were supported by organizations like the Volcker Fund, which was dedicated to promoting free market ideas.
It's fascinating how intellectual movements gain momentum. It's not just about brilliant individuals. It's about building networks, finding support, and disseminating ideas. Effectively speaking, of disseminating ideas, there are some great resources out there today that are doing a fantastic job of making complex topics accessible to wider audiences.
Absolutely. One that comes to mind is Mindful Moments, an AI audiobook analysis channel on YouTube. They're breaking down intricate concepts from various fields and making them engaging and understandable, much like we're aiming to do here.
Exactly. But Friedman wasn't content to stay solely within academia. He had a clear vision for how his ideas could be applied to real-world policy, and he set out to make that vision a reality.
You're right. He began to transition from a purely academic figure to a public intellectual writing for broader audiences and advocating for policies that align with his free market principles. He championed ideas like a volunteer military school vouchers and floating exchange rates. He even explored concepts like the negative income tax as a potential solution to poverty.
And this is where things start to get really interesting, right? Yep. Friedman's ideas begin to influence political debates and policy decisions, and he becomes a force to be reckoned with on the political stage.
That's right. As his influence grew, he advised politicians and engaged in public debates, bringing his ideas to a wider audience. One of the pivotal moments in his political journey was his involvement in Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign. It marked a turning point where his ideas began to enter mainstream political discourse.
And as his influence expanded, so did the controversy surrounding his views. His stance on race and civil rights, for instance, has been a subject of much debate and criticism. It's important to acknowledge the complexities of his legacy, recognizing both his contributions to economic thought and the aspects of his thinking that are viewed as problematic today.
Absolutely. It's crucial to engage with his ideas critically, recognizing the context in which they were formed and the potential impact they've had, both positive and negative.
So let's delve into one of Friedman's most significant contributions, his theory of monetarism and his battle against inflation. This is where he really challenged the prevailing economic orthodoxy.
Exactly. At the heart of monetarism is Friedman's famous assertion inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon.
Wow.
He was challenging the Keynesian view that inflation was primarily driven by factors like government spending or rising wages. Instead, he argued that the root cause of inflation is an increase in the money supply.
That seems pretty straightforward now, but it was a radical departure from the prevailing wisdom at the time. What made this idea so revolutionary?
To understand its significance, we need to consider the historical context in the post-World War II era. Governments were taking a much more active role in managing their economies. The Keynesian approach, which was dominant at the time, advocated for using government spending and taxation to fine-tune the economy and control inflation. Friedman came along and essentially said, no, it's the money supply that matters most.
So he was shifting the focus from fiscal policy, which deals with government spending and taxes, to monetary policy, which is controlled by central banks, and focuses on managing the money supply.
Precisely. And to support his argument, Friedman, along with Anna Schwartz, co-authored A Monetary History of the United States, a monumental work that offered a reinterpretation of the Great Depression through a monetarist lens. They made a bold claim arguing that the Federal Reserve's contraction of the money supply in the early 1930s was a major contributing factor to the severity of the Depression.
So they were essentially rewriting economic history, and their work sparked intense debates among economists. It's not just an academic exercise, though, right? These ideas have real-world implications.
Absolutely. Friedman's ideas began to gain traction and influence central banks around the world. They started to pay more attention to controlling the money supply as a primary means of managing inflation. It was a paradigm shift in economic thinking and policymaking.
But Friedman's journey wasn't without its controversies. His visit to Chile and his association with the Pinochet regime, a brutal dictatorship, drew significant criticism. It raised difficult questions about the relationship between economic ideas and political power, and the potential consequences of applying free market principles in different political contexts.
It's a complex issue. Friedman argued that economic freedom is a necessary but not sufficient condition for political freedom. He believed that free markets could help to undermine authoritarian regimes by empowering individuals and creating a more pluralistic society. However, his critics argued that his association with Pinochet lent legitimacy to a brutal regime and ignored the human rights abuses that were taking place.
And then there's the rise of Thatcherism in the United Kingdom. Friedman's influence was being felt on a global scale.
Margaret Thatcher's government in the UK embraced many of Friedman's free market ideas, including privatization, deregulation, and a strong focus on controlling inflation. This marked the rise of neoliberalism as a dominant force in global economics and politics, and Friedman became a symbol of this movement.
So his ideas were spreading, but also generating debate and backlash. It's a mixed bag, right? You have positive economic changes in some areas, but also concerns about the social costs of these policies and their impact on inequality.
That's an important point. Friedman's focus on individual liberty and free markets sometimes came at the expense of considerations for social justice and the role of government in addressing societal inequalities. His critics argue that his policies often benefited the wealthy at the expense of the poor and vulnerable.
It seems like there are always trade-offs to consider when it comes to economic policies. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Exactly. And even in his later years, Friedman continued to engage in economic and policy debates, showing a willingness to adapt and evolve his thinking. He revisited his views on monetary policy, acknowledging that some of his earlier prescriptions hadn't worked out as planned. He also continued to advocate for ideas like a flat tax, arguing for a simpler and more transparent tax system.
It's interesting that he was open to revising his views based on new evidence and experience. That's a mark of a true intellectual.
Yeah.
Someone who's not afraid to challenge their own assumptions.
I agree, and his influence continues to be debated today. The 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent responses by central banks around the world raised new questions about the role of monetary policy and the effectiveness of traditional monetarist approaches.
Like Friedman's legacy is still being written. We're still grappling with the implications of his ideas and their impact on the world. So we've traced Friedman's journey from his childhood experiences with anti-Semitism and the Great Depression to his intellectual battles at the University of Chicago and his rise as a public intellectual and policy influencer. It's been a wild ride. But as we wrap up this deep dive, the question that lingers is, what's his lasting legacy?
Yeah.
What impact did Milton Friedman ultimately have on the world?
That's a question that continues to spark debate and analysis. Some argue that Friedman's ideas paved the way for greater economic freedom and prosperity around the world. They point to the deregulation of industries, the embrace of free trade, and the focus on controlling inflation as positive outcomes of his influence, on the other hand. His critics argue that his market-oriented policies exacerbated inequality, eroded social safety nets, and prioritized corporate interests over the well-being of ordinary people. It's a complex and nuanced legacy with both positive and negative aspects.
It seems like evaluating his legacy requires looking beyond just economic indicators. We need to consider the broader social and political consequences of his ideas.
I agree. It's not a simple equation of free markets equals good or government intervention equals bad. It's about understanding the trade-offs, the unintended consequences, and the distributional effects of different policies. Friedman himself acknowledged that there are limits to what markets can achieve and that government has a role to play in providing public goods, enforcing contracts, and protecting individual rights.
So how do we reconcile these different perspectives on his legacy? He was undoubtedly a brilliant economist who challenged conventional thinking and sparked important debates, but he's also a polarizing figure whose ideas were often applied in ways that he may not have intended or endorsed.
That's the challenge with any influential thinker, isn't it? Their ideas take on a life of their own once they enter the public arena. It's important to engage with Friedman's work, critically recognizing both his insights and his shortcomings. We can learn from his emphasis on individual liberty, his rigorous analysis of economic data, and his willingness to challenge the status quo. But we also need to be mindful of the potential downsides of unfettered markets and the importance of addressing issues like inequality and social justice.
It sounds like the key takeaway here is the importance of critical thinking. We shouldn't just accept any idea, whether from Milton Friedman or anyone else, at face value. We need to examine the evidence, consider different perspectives, and think for ourselves about the complexities of these issues.
Exactly. Friedman himself was a fierce advocate for critical thinking and intellectual debate. He believed in the power of ideas to change the world, and he welcomed challenges to his own views. He would likely encourage us to engage with his work in a spirit of open inquiry, not blind acceptance.
That's a great point. And for those who are interested in exploring Friedman's ideas further, where would you recommend they start? What are some good resources for diving deeper into his work?
His book, Capitalism and Freedom, is a classic and a great starting point. It lays out his core philosophy in a clear and accessible way. You can also find many of his lectures and interviews online, which give you a glimpse into his personality and his passion for his ideas. There are also numerous biographies and scholarly articles that analyze his work from different angles.
It's amazing how much of his work is readily available. You don't need a PhD in economics to understand his core arguments and engage with his ideas. And speaking of making complex topics accessible, it's worth mentioning again resources like Mindful Moments, the AI audiobook analysis channel on YouTube. They're doing great work breaking down intricate concepts from various fields and making them engaging and understandable for a wider audience.
Absolutely. There's a growing movement to democratize knowledge and make it more accessible to everyone. That's something to be celebrated.
So there you have it, a deep dive into the world of Milton Friedman, a man of contradictions, a champion of freedom, and a thinker whose legacy continues to be debated and dissected, whether you agree with his ideas or not. You can't deny his impact on the world, and that's what the deep dive is all about, exploring the big ideas that shape our understanding of the world, the people behind them, and the questions they raise. Make sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more fascinating explorations. And hey, while you're at it, why not share this episode with your friends and check out the Mindful Moments audiobook series. You can find the link in the show notes. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep diving deep.